So for today's depth of field experiment, we'll be using the Sony a7S II. It features a CMOS sensor, shoots in 4K. We're also using Rokinon Cine glass, manufactured in Korea. It features 9 different stops of light: 1.5, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22.
We're shooting with a 24mm lens. It's all the way open at a 1.5 f-stop, and I'm about 1.295 meters away from the camera. We're at an f2, and I'm still 1.295 meters away from the camera. The same lens, the 24mm lens, except we're at a 2.8 f-stop. Now we're at an f4. Brandon's been boosting up the ISO on the camera, just so as we close down on f-stops, we still have the same amount of light coming in the sense of so you can still see. And it does not affect depth of field whatsoever. It just changes the sensitivity of the sensor to allow more light to come in, so you can still see at a lower f-stop. All right, everybody, now we're at a 5.6 f-stop, and Brandon again is adjusting the ISO accordingly. We have an f8 f-stop now. We've adjusted the ISO accordingly. As you can see, even from the 5.6, we're at an f8 now. The depth of field has grown significantly. The trees behind me have become a lot more clear, and the overall image quality has become a lot sharper. All right, now we're here at an f11 f-stop with the depth of field growing even sharper of an image. All right, guys, now we're here. We're at an f16, and we're almost all the way closed on the lens. But without Brandon adjusting the ISO is at about 5,000. Without adjusting that, the image would probably be completely dark, if not almost close to being completely dark. So we adjust accordingly, just so again you can see the depth of field change. We were fully closed at an f22, and again Brandon had to adjust the ISO accordingly. We actually went up from 5,000, we're now at 8,000, and due to the sensitivity of the sensor at 8,000 ISO, you could be getting a little bit of noise or grain in the quality of the image, but for depth of field purposes, everything should be completely clear, and we should have almost full range of depth of field with using this lens. All right, everybody, so now we switched over to the 35mm lens. We're open at a 1.5 f-stop, and as you can tell from behind me, now that we've moved over, so we're roughly 2.388 meters away. The trees behind me now, since we're fully open, they're not as clear as they would be as when we were at the f22 before on the 24mm lens. Now we're at an f2. There might be a subtle change behind me as we've closed down just a little bit. We're at a 2.8. Brandon had to adjust the ISO a little bit just to make sure that we have a bright image, allowing more light into the sensor for sensitivity purposes. We're at an f4, and as you can tell, there's probably a bigger significant change in the depth of field versus the 1.5 stated before. So now we're closed down to an f5.6. Closed down to an f8. The background should be getting a little bit more sharper, and the depth of field has definitely grown significantly from the 1.5. All right, now we are at an f11. The trees in the background should definitely be getting more clear as we close down. We're at an f16. All right, we are fully closed down at an f22. So therefore, we should have a lot of depth of field in the back. All right, everybody, so now we switched over to the 85mm lens. We are open at a 1.5, and I'm roughly 3.531 meters away from the camera. The 85mm has the most limited depth of field versus the other two lenses that we're using today. due to because that the fact that the width of the iris is a lot wider than the previous lenses that we used. This is the f2 on the 85mm lens. Now we're on the 2.8 f-stop on the 85mm lens. We're at an f4 on the 85mm lens. You should definitely start to see the depth of field changing a little bit in the background behind me. Now we're at a 5.6 f-stop on the 85mm lens. Now we are at an f8 on the 85mm lens. The depth of field definitely increased from previous, and the image has definitely become sharper in the background. Now we're at an f11 on the 85mm lens. Now we're at an f16 on the 85mm lens. Brandon has been adjusting the ISO accordingly, and the depth of field has grown significantly from the last. Now we are fully closed on the 85mm lens. We are at an f22, which is giving us the most depth of field that this lens can get, and the background should be completely sharp and clear.
So what is f-stop? As you can see here, we have our Rokinon Cine lens. It is attached to the Sony a7S II camera, which features a full-frame CMOS sensor. The iris is the mechanism that controls the opening in the lens. The opening is what's known as the aperture. So as you can see here, this is an example of what an open iris would look like. The aperture is open wide, and this is a closed iris. The aperture is very small. Based on how open the aperture is will dictate how much light is emitted through the lens. What f-stop refers to is the different stages of openings that the iris can control the aperture to be. For example, something like a f1.5 would look something like this, letting in a lot of light, whereas an f number or stop of 22 would be very closed, letting in less light. When dealing with a very open iris, there's a lot more light coming through, creating a very limited depth of field. When you have a closed iris, your light is essentially going through almost a pinhole, creating more depth of field and a sharper image overall. So f-stop and aperture, what's the relationship? So as you go up a single stop, you're essentially doubling the amount of light in the aperture. As you can see here, we have a 350mm area size for our aperture. If you open up one stop, you'd go to a 700mm area for our aperture, essentially doubling the amount of light that's going through the lens. Even further so, if you were to open up even more, you'd go from 700mm to 1400mm, doubling our area size. But what does that have to say about the diameter of the opening? So essentially, you're not doubling the diameter of the opening, you're multiplying it by the square root of 2. So 30mm becomes 42mm in terms of diameter. 42 millimeters would become 60 millimeters in terms of diameter here. Essentially what's happening is, as you open, you're doubling the light, and as you're closing, you're halving the amount of light that enters the lens. Alright, so essentially the magic number in this entire situation is the square root of 2. So in this instance, x represents our f number. So if you were to take the focal length and divide it by the f number, you get your diameter. So to keep everything proportional in terms of light, as you multiply the diameter by the square root of 2, you're essentially going to divide your f number by the square root of 2. That's why in a lot of instances when you look on a lens or something, you might see f over x equals the diameter. You see it written as f over 2, f over 4, f over 5.6. That's because of this relationship right here. So this equation represents what would happen if you were trying to increase the amount of light. If you were trying to close down the lens, you'd divide the diameter by the square root of 2 and you'd multiply your f number by the square root of 2. It works both ways on the scale. What's super interesting though is, say you have a 50 millimeter lens and you have a diameter of say 25 millimeters, that would essentially be letting in the same amount of light as say a 100 millimeter lens with a diameter of 50 millimeters. Because of this relationship, even though they're different focal lengths, at that diameter length, both of these lenses would be letting in the same amount of light. So here you can see we have our f-stop scale. So as the f number decreases, the opening or the aperture increases. Essentially, every single time you go up a number, you're doubling the amount of light. As you go down, you're halving the amount of light.